Good afternoon. Hope everyone is doing well. We are going to continue our study in James today. It's going to be James 2, 14 through 26 will be the focus as we work through this. Last week we of course covered James 1 through 13, dealing with favoritism and how we are all equal in the eyes of God. And this week we are going to work more with how faith and works are synonymous. Some people would agree with that, and some people would not, depending on how you were raised and where you came from. But that's one thing we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at the difference between what Paul thought related to faith and works and what James believes related to faith and works. And we'll actually see that they're a whole lot closer than sometimes we allow them to be as we go through this. We'll also kind of through this uncover God's expectations regarding how we live based on the faith we have in Christ and how genuine faith affects our daily walk. Before I read what we'll be going through this afternoon, I wanted to give you a little bit more kind of a background between James's thoughts related to faith and works and Paul's thoughts related to faith and works, because they are very different in some cases, but yet they kind of end up in the same place. Some people actually see what James wrote related to this topic is kind of a denunciation of what Paul taught regarding the justification by faith. It's almost, someone would look at it as a intra-canonical tension between these two. And some have really brought that out. And I think if you remember from last week, I brought up Martin Luther was not a big fan of the book of James, and actually added a few things to Romans 3:28 to kind of help his case. So if you looked at Romans 3:28, you'd see that he added the word alone there in that verse, which would of course help his argument related to his thought on how Paul did it right and how James probably did not do it right. There are Protestants like Martin Luther who would lean towards this idea of sola fide or faith alone, or justification by faith alone, and that's fine, and if that's how people want to go in that direction, but I don't see that fully, especially if you looked at the only time you really see faith alone truly written in the original language, not added by Martin Luther, you would see in James 24 is the only place that you would see that, where James actually explicitly denies the idea that faith alone justifies. As I'd mentioned earlier in this letter, if you looked at, say, James 1:22, James tells us we should be hearers and doers of the word. As he said, we deceive ourselves if we are just hearers and not doers. We believe we are something that we are not. And that's something that, of course, very much bothered James. You can kind of feel that tension as we go through this letter and see that it was not something that he approved of or appreciated of what he was seeing in the community related to that. I think a lot of this was tied to how people responded to the Torah law. You got to remember his community were mainly Jewish, or people with a Jewish background, or at least culturally Jewish, and they understood the Torah, and the Torah a lot of it was based on law, and of course a lot of that was based on works. Now Paul gets in that too as well, but this is something that James was dealing with throughout this. You can compare, if you wanted to, you can compare what we'll be reading today, James 2:14 through 26, with Galatians 2:16 through 3:29. And what that would be, you'll be able to see a literary relationship. The author of James knew about this letter of Galatians. It seems like James either was aware that Galatians was written, or was familiar with the topics within Galatians, and we see some of those ties as we go through it. There's some argument related to is how much was James influenced by Paul. Some would say that he was influenced significantly by Paul. Others would say not so much. Again, it depends on what commentator you're reading and what kind of, what your background is from. Some would say he was anti-Paulinism. I would say he's not. I would say he's not either for or against Paul. He had his own argument, and a lot of those arguments, or a lot of those ideas, they actually, like I said, do mesh up as we go through here. There are a lot of parallelisms between James and Paul, And that, you know, I could also see that James, there was some influence and from Paul. And so it's one of those things where there's not a black and white. How much influence did James have from Paul? How much did he agree with or disagree with? There's some clarity as we read through this, and we're going to try to bring out some of that clarity today. But there is so much conversation and so much debate about how this could work out. Others would argue, from another perspective, would be that this book was not even written by James, but was written by someone who was more of a Paulinist, someone who had followed Paul and was close to Paul. And they would say that is true because there's a lot of similarities in the rhetoric and the way that James was written that was very similar to some of the stuff that Paul would write. Now, again, you'd have others to say there's no similarities whatsoever. How can you even argue that? But there are two camps when it comes to this. He wrote in a way that first century Christians, or probably better said Messianic Jews, would very much understand and engage in a theological and pastoral reasoning based on what he wrote. A lot of what they did and when he wrote and how he wrote and how Paul wrote was very much the Socratic method related to the use of questions and answer styles. And you see a lot of those similarities as we go through this. Other things to think about with James and Paul regarding how their social historical world was constructed during that time. We see a template of apocalyptic eschatology built into this. We see some unspecified afflictions and trials that are built into what James wrote as well as what Paul wrote. Exhortations to the virtues of wakefulness, strong hearts, and patience. You see that in James, you see that in Paul. Both engage in a discussion of Jewish laws. Both are obviously very familiar. We know for sure that Paul is extremely familiar with the Torah. He admits that himself. And then we can assume that James was as well, just based on his background and everything. N.T. Wright has a lot to say on this, and some of what we'll be going through today is some of what N.T. Wright would write or teach on when it comes to this. I hope not to butcher it too much, but there is a lot of influence, and he's written a lot on James related to this. Sometimes you would look at this from, when I'm referring to N.T. Wright, is this idea of there's an apparent discrepancy between James and Paul. Goes away when we see the discrepancy actually goes away when we observe what they are each arguing for and against. You could say, and this goes back to there's some very similar language and grammar and usage here, that they're using the same language but have different reference in mind, and they address different concerns. And so they're going to the same place, they just get there a little bit differently. You could look at this as they're against different things. So Paul is against the people who demand Gentiles become Jewish proselytes as a condition for following Jesus. So before they can even follow Jesus, they have to take multiple steps, become actually Jewish proselytes, and do it. And there was a significant, powerful group that was trying to make that happen. And of course, that was something that Paul was against. James was against those who teach salvation by mere assent. So I'll say that I'm saved, but there's actually no works. There's no fruit. You could look at works and fruit of the Spirit in very similar ways without actually. So I say that I believe, but there's actually nothing that I do that's related to anything that Jesus taught. That is what bothered James. And there's, of course, was a group of people who were thinking in the same way. And that happened then, and that happens now when it comes to people's thought as I've checked that box, I'm a believer, and now I just can do whatever I want to do. But that's not at all what James would teach or what he was saying here. So they're heading, like I said, they're heading in the same direction. It's just going to take them a little bit more time for each one of them to get there of what they're referring to when it comes to faith and works. Now, if we look at this a little bit more, the two viewpoints, again leading in the same direction, can be brought together when we see that James said faith without deeds is dead, which is what we'll see in James 2:26. And you can correlate that with what Paul's remark is the only thing that counts is faith working through love in Galatians 5:6. And so they're actually saying some very similar things there related to what faith is and what works is, and how the two are actually synonymous, as some people would argue. What this really kind of tells us, and what N.T. Wright would probably say related to this is that, well, first of all, there's books written about just James and Paul and their differences or presumed differences, or how they get from their point A to their point B and how they get there together or sometimes apart. Like I said, there's so many things written about this. We're covering a very high level part of it. But let's keep all this in mind, as he would say that the word of truth brings salvation and transformation. And that's both of what James and Paul are trying to get to, is that the word brings both salvation and transformation. And if you're not seeing that, if that's not how it's working in the lives of the people of this community, or in your life for that matter, that is where the issue or the concern should be. As we look into these verses, we're going to start with, there's actually two different sections. You have verses 14 through 17, which we'll start with, is an interrogation with a sharp rebuttal coming from James. And then in verses 18 through 26, you see a set of challenges presented by James. And so this section of Scripture is broken up into those two areas. He is only making one point in this passage, and it is about faith without works and how that does not work. And you'll see that in 14 through 16 is faith without works is useless. In verse 14 by itself is that faith cannot save without works. Is ineffective if you look at verse 20. And then if you looked at verses 17 and 26, faith without works is dead. And so those are kind of the areas that James will be touching upon as we go through this. He is not concerned, and this is something that I think we sometimes get confused. He's not concerned with the relationship between faith and works. Instead, he is concerned about the necessity of works in faith, and we'll get a little bit deeper into that. But before we do, let's think about more of what the definition of faith is. And so the New Testament or Greek word that is being used here is pistis or pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S, is how we would spell it in our modern day English. Which often is a firm type of persuasion, conviction, or trust. It could be used in many of those ways. The specific way it's using here, so that was kind of is patho, which is translated as believe, have confidence, persuade, trust, and I think the biggest part of this is obey as part of that as well. So in James's viewpoint, faith can be defined as an active obedience. So think of it that way. Now if we define works, these are not human works. And so these are not activities that we come up on our own and decide to do on our own. These are works that flow through from the Holy Spirit, which is why I brought up the fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about in Galatians 5, 22 through 23. So that is the type of works. That is the type of deeds, depending, those words are interchangeable, that James is referring to here when he goes through this. So let's keep that in mind. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian during the time of World War II, wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you reading it. It's a pretty short read, but it's extremely dense. It's excellent. Anyways, in an area of that book is, or chapter I guess you could call it that, is called Cheap Grace. And Bonhoeffer describes it, and I'm going to give an extremely small amount of information here, but it is something that I'd highly recommend that you look into. But he kind of summarized what James is saying here as in only those who believe obey, and only that he is obedient believes. In one case, faith is the condition of obedience, and in the other, obedience is the condition of faith. They're synonymous. They work together. That's how I read it from James, and that's how I'm seeing it from what Dietrich Bonhoeffer would have said whenever he wrote that in The Cost of Discipleship. Again, I highly recommend that book if you have not read it before. It is quite a eye-opening, and I would say even to a point life-changing book if you allow it to be that. Okay, that was quite an introduction into what we're talking about today. We're going to start here, like I said. We'll read verses 14 through 17, discuss those a little bit, and then from there go from 18 to 26. So let me read James 2, 14 through 17, so you guys kind of have it all in your mind as we go through this, and then we'll move forward. What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? See here, he's starting with two questions, which was what I brought up earlier related to that. If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and be filled," and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. The mercy that James speaks of, is you'd have to go back into verse 13, is now expounded upon, better way to say, in these upcoming verses related to works. We take that to be that faith, works, and even mercy is what it takes to have a proper faith. So we're kind of adding a little bit of a piece here, is that proper faith involves works of mercy, or you could, again, like I said, fruits of the Spirit, things that are coming through the Spirit, through our relationship with who God is. James is living within a kind of what you'd refer to as a merciless community at this point. They are very inconsistent, not only with what God taught, but what God taught, or what they learned about God from the Torah and from what they read in the scriptures of the Old Testament. They're also being inconsistent with what Jesus taught when he was here on earth, and is not doing what we saw last week when we referred to this as the royal law of love God, love others, and everything that Jesus would speak about if you went back to the Sermon on the Mount, if you went back to Deuteronomy 6, I believe also Leviticus 19, the Shema that Jesus brings up to be able to talk about that as well. We'll go a little bit deeper into that here in a minute. But they're being inconsistent with that. They're not feeding their neighbors. They're not helping those who are in need. They're doing everything is the exact opposite of what James is trying to teach them to do, and of what Jesus taught them to do. The works of love and obedience, you can see some good examples of those. So I would encourage you to jot these down. Luke 3, 7 through 14, Romans 2, 6 through 8, and then Galatians 6, 4 through 6 would all provide you with some good insight to what James is pointing to here. You can also think about this as works may indicate the presence of faith, but to James, the absence of work proves the absence of faith. That can bring about what James calls the good that he is referring to here in these scriptures, the good of what comes out of someone who is a person of faith, who is living out that faith in obedience to who God had called that person to be. Like I said, we will need to remember that James is speaking to a Jewish community 2,000 years ago, but he's also, he was not writing this thinking, 2,000 years from now people are going to read this. He was writing it to his community during that time, which is a Jewish community. But fortunately, the way it was written and how it was composed allows us to be able to see, wait, this reflects on us as well. And we can ask those same questions to us as what that he's asking. If someone says he has faith but he has no works, can that faith save him? Those are the same sort of questions we can ask today, because as we go into these next few verses of his example that he provides, and these are real life examples that James is providing. This isn't something that he's just pulling out of the air. There's enough evidence to show us here that this is something that his community is experiencing and that they're dealing with. As we continue on through this, is the question that he's asking here, can that faith save him, there in verse 14, is an emphatic no, as in absolutely not, based on pretty much the structure that James is putting in place here about what is to live a life of faith. Confessional faith, which is the kind of faith James is referring to, is a confessional faith in God as one, and Jesus as the Messiah as sufficient for redemption. So they have confessed that sort of faith, and it comes out through the way they live. So faith without mercy, love, compassion, as James is defining it here in this verse, cannot save that kind of person. Based on looking at chapter 1, I believe it's verse 21, the use of the word saved. God saves in part through the implanted word. The salvation is a regenerative, morally transforming, and internal is what we see here through a saving faith. So that the save that you see here in verse 14, pointing back to verse 21 of save your souls, he's tying all those things together. So we continue to look through this. James believed that those who claim to have faith, So there are these two questions. We're still in verse 14. Those who claim to have faith but do not have works will not be saved. Unfortunately today, that is still a belief. Not unfortunately today, that's still a belief, but unfortunately people still live that way. To have a faith, or say they have a faith, but do nothing, or their life does not produce any sort of good fruit or produce any good works or deeds that would reflect upon that. Let's go on to verse 15. We're kind of dealing with an if-then statement. For those of you who are programmers or familiar with if-then statements, we're getting that from James, and so it would be almost kind of the way it's written in Greek. It'd almost be kind of comical if it was not so tragic what he was dealing with in that context and in that time period of actually living in a community where this sort of thing was going on. Anytime you see is without clothing, depending on your translation, it could be also translated as naked, is a big word in Judaism. It's a word of shame, a word of defenselessness, and so it's more than just I don't have a shirt to wear. It is I am someone who has been shamed within the community. I am someone who is now defenseless. I have nothing to help me, nothing to save me. So it's not just I'm without some clothes. This is a very much more of a stronger word than that. As we continue on here, when he brings up food, means they do not have an adequate amount to survive. It's not just I didn't eat today, people were dying of starvation in their community. This, as we know, continues on. So if you were to turn to Acts 6:1, within communities, people were still not getting adequate food. And so as we know, this is an ongoing occurrence within that community, and James continues to bring it up here. Again, like I said, he would not bring this up unless it was something that was actually happening within the community, because that's just the way he wrote, and that was how these letters would work. He's not just providing some random examples or thoughts. It's not a pastoral story. It is a real, true issue that is going on within that community. When James says here, one of you, in order, he's not trying to call out, and I'm now looking at verse 16, and one of you says to them. So what he's saying here, he's not calling out a specific individual, like even to the point of you priest or you leaders of the church or you leaders of the community. He's keeping it pretty generic here, but at the same time, he's not calling one person out, yet he's calling them all out. So this is a community issue. This is not just an issue for the church leadership. This is not just an issue for the priests. This is not just an issue for the government authorities. This is an issue that James is calling out to all people within the community. So they claim to be people of faith, but they are not living out that level of faith. The idea of when he says, go in peace, a very typical Jewish saying that they would hear and be very familiar with, pointed to out as it's something that you would say maybe after a time in the synagogue. Scripture has been read, they've discussed the scripture, and they are to go in peace. Well, he's actually kind of mocking that at this point based on how he's saying that. So it's almost like he's providing them as like how you're saying this to these people. When he says, go in peace and be warmed and be filled, it is almost like a false piety that he's providing, or false claims, false religion. It's one of those things where you come to a church service on a Sunday or Wednesday or whenever you're doing church, and you come out and then you've learned all these new great ways to possibly live or how to reflect on the Bible or apply maybe some scripture, and then you just completely forget it. But then at the same time, you act like you're a person of piety, and it's like, well, no, you're not. Because you're not living out that way. And excuse me, that is what James is seeing here. In verse 16, as we continue into this, they say things that sound pious. It pleases the ears of those around them, so those who don't know any better. They claim to be Messianic Jews, yet they do not follow the Messiah who came to this earth as a poor person to serve those who are poor and to show them mercy. So they've missed the point, according to James, at this time. You can also think of this as they know the Torah. They know based on the Torah and the teachings of Jesus what they should be doing, but they yet do nothing for those who have made their needs obvious to them. So people have come to them in need. And it's again one of those things of know and knowing. Of is it a know of, oh, okay, I'm aware that there's these hungry people. It's like a fact. There are 100 hungry people in our town. Okay, that's a fact. Versus deep down knowing and understanding that it is something that is in me, and I now understand the significance of these 100 hungry people, and I'm now going to go do something about it based on who I am and my obedience to God. As we continue on here into verse 17, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. The New English Bible translation has I like the way that it was translated. I've been reading typically the NASB, but the NEB has a good version as well. It says, so with faith, if it does not lead to action, it is in itself a lifeless thing. This brings a conclusion to the first few verses of this section, where faith without works cannot save. The claims and wishes in verses 15 and 16, as James is saying here, are worthless. The use of the word of faith, or pistis, in 2:5 and later on in 2:22 is this trusting and obeying in God is not happening in this community, and James continues to pull that out. But in this verse, as well as in verses 18, 20, and 24, faith is kind of stalled within the community. It is a claim to faith that does not manifest good works. It cannot save. The two have to be together. It's not sequential. The two have to be together. James right here, as we finish up this fourth verse section, is describing an absolute condition, a zero-sum game. He is not requiring a certain amount of works. It's like, if you do these three things, that is not what James is saying. Or he's not even truly defining what a good work is. That's not the point of this. If he did, the whole idea would die under the burden of definitions and stipulations, much like a lot of what the law had become. A lot of those, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and some of the other religious rulers had put so many laws and additional burdens on people because they over-defined things that didn't need to be defined. And James is avoiding that because he knows what it can do to a community, and so he is keeping that from happening here. And so he's not even defining what a good work is, because the thing is like, oh, okay, I've done that good work, I'm set. Well, no, you're not, and because it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle of obedience is what the expectation is and what James is looking for. This next section that we go into, it was almost like we get some sort of inner dialogue. So as we go into, not even an inner dialogue, it could be, some people would argue it is, others would argue an opponent has come forth and is coming after James. Some have looked at it that way. These are verses 18 through 26, where you kind of have a conversation and you could even say a debate about exactly what James is speaking of. So I'm going to just do this a little bit differently here. So verse 18, but someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. This is legendary. This section has been debated for centuries. It'll be debated for centuries after this. You are probably debating it within your head right now as we think through this. You're probably thinking about all the other scripture or references or books or articles that you've read in the past that sound either really right on with this or counter to this, or it makes you very awkward and uncomfortable. It depends. So it's going to continue to be debated, but let me put a little bit of perspective in it to see what James is teaching here. So first of all, who is speaking? It's sometimes we kind of overlook the quotes and the grammatical pieces and parts that we see within these writings, and sometimes overlook them. So one thing is first of all, who is speaking here? Is it James? Is it a friend of James, or some other person taking part of the dialogue, like an opponent of some sort? Who is I and who is you? And this is another way to kind of look at this. Is James having a conversation with himself, kind of just providing two perspectives, kind of being his own devil's advocate? Or is he repeating a previous conversation? So he's had a conversation in the last week or whenever it was recently, and now he is just kind of repeating it, or retelling that conversation to the people who are reading this letter. That could be an option as well. Why does this person say they have works? Why do they not say that James or the person who is speaking to have works? I mean, there's a lot of different pieces and parts to this. First of all, let's look at also who is someone. Is it James or a friend of James? Is it? And these are all different from different commentaries or different perspectives from other theologians over time who have looked at this and wondered, who is this someone that James is referring to? Does he have someone in mind? Is he just kind of using himself in the story? Is it like I said, a conversation from the past, recent past? So think about, is this someone, a Jew, possibly a Jew who affirms that a former understanding of Jewish theology and how he sees Christian works different from the works of the Torah? So New Testament works are not acceptable. So only works that you'd see from what were brought out of or derived from the Old Testament. Well, they wouldn't refer to it as the Old Testament, but the Torah. Maybe that's what counts, but not New Testament works or something that happens now in New Testament perspective. Like I said, it could be an imaginary opponent, someone who he's making up and kind of having this conversation with. Someone who's come out of the community, who objects with James, but speaks similar to what James is speaking and kind of a different viewpoint. It could also be someone who affirms the validity of two approaches to redemption, one for faith and another for works, but both being equal and valid, in the same way that spiritual gifts are equal and valid, or that faith and works are distinguishable. They are separate and different. I would say that's probably not that one, just because what James seems to be saying here is that they're synonymous. They come together. It's not sequential in how faith and works. Let's look at the one who is speaking. Let's do this as in the ones who is speaking is an opponent to James, and let's see how that would work out. So this could be a diatribe that's reflecting the opponent's view. James is responding in the second half of the verse, possibly where he says, "Show me your faith." Some would argue to remove the pronouns and clear up what is being said. And so this is, again, a completely different commentary viewpoint on this, is that someone could say that actually what is just being said here is you remove the pronouns and it says one has faith, one has works. So they combine. That could be one way to look at it. For the second part of 18 to make sense, James must have understood the person speaking of faith and works as separating them. Right? James doesn't want to separate them. But the person that is his opponent seems to be. So you could broaden this statement or this verse even further and says, one has faith, one has works, and both are equally acceptable ways of living out the covenant God has with Israel. James would actually and emphatically would say no to this. That is not even possible. You cannot have a workless faith. Even though there are people who are arguing you could, he would say no, that is not possible. To kind of summarize this a little bit, the opponent wants to separate faith and works as two different and two separate things. But James cannot allow for this view of faith and works. James says that without faith, faith without works cannot lead to salvation. So here, James is, of course, challenging his opponent. The opponent is someone you could say is representing the merciless, workless believers who show faith without works. So someone who is trying to justify, I can have faith without works. Someone who's trying to say, all I have to do is believe. But we'll see what James says to that here in a minute. But that's not true. You can't just believe. There's more to it. I don't want to ruin the rest of this if I go too far ahead with that. To James, faith cannot be reduced to trust or a creedal orthodoxy. Faith to James flowers into acts of mercy to the poor and the marginalized. Otherwise, again, without beating a dead horse, there is no salvation. Let's move into verse 19. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. So James is making his point here related to, well, okay, if you want to make that argument of all I have to have is faith that God exists, well, so do the demons. And so you're no better than them, and they kind of get it, and it seems like you don't, at least to a point. So again, James does not believe that faith alone is saving, and he goes after his opponent again, this time using this kind of demon example. We now know what faith he is referring to, faith in one God and the God of Israel. This can also be read as there is one God, as in you believe that there is one God instead of you believe that God is one. So again, he's doing some very interesting things, because you got to think there's Romans who are probably listening to this, and Romans were polytheistic in their beliefs, and there are probably other people, pagan religions, we'll just call them that, even though to themselves were not pagans. They were around this community too, because if this letter goes out to the diaspora Jewish community, which is throughout that region, other people who were not monotheists were seeing that. And so James is kind of inserting an argument for monotheists as we go through this to those who are more of your polytheistic believers. And so it's really great and powerful that he says here, and we can't overlook the power of what he is saying, of that there is one God, and it is to have faith in one God, the one and only God, and the God of Israel, or the Jewish God. We also see this here for those of you who are really tied into your Jewish history, or who are possibly even Messianic Jews who would be looking at this, is that we get a little version or a part of the Shema, where it starts with God is one. This prayer was said at daybreak. It's said during noon, during sacrifice, and in the evening, and possibly even when they came or left their home. So to admit that there is one God, God is one, would be said. Somebody's referred to this as the Jesus Creed, and if you were to turn to Mark 12:28 through 32, you would see that as well. So it includes a daily confession, and so if you were to look at Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 8, as well as Numbers 15, 37 through 41, even Leviticus 19:18, all have references to that. We can dig a little bit deeper into this, into what the Shema is, because James is talking to a Jewish community, knowing the Shema very well, of course, because imagine he probably did pray it every day, even after becoming a follower of Christ, would still do this. So if we look at that here, we'd say God is one, which we get from Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5, and we're also getting it in James 2:19. And then we have love God, which is Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5. We also see in James 1:12 as well as James 2:5. And then love others, Leviticus 19:18, and then James 2:8. All of those are being tied in together here to what James is trying to say. The person that this opponent who is opposing James would know the Shema. Probably, again, not only James, but this person who is the opponent, as well as most people in the Jewish community, at some point we're going through the motions and probably saying the Shema daily. So how could this person, I guess the question you could ask is, this person, this opponent, ourselves today even if we don't admit or say that we say the Shema, how could this person every day repeat this prayer or this creed and be oblivious to those in need around them? It is incomprehensible to James, and that's the point he is trying to make here. Sarcastic James hits there at the second part of verse 19. You do well, he says, and that is actually pretty sarcastic when he says it. He's being sarcastic to them, and you can kind of get a little sense of his personality here. He is already, we know, of course, that he does not agree with them, because he's already referred to them as being useless back in chapter 2, well, just when I was reading earlier in verses 14 through 16. And they are senseless if we looked at verse 20 as we move forward, or even useless depending on which translation that you have. Referring to the demons that we see here, demons shudder in the face of God, but these useless and senseless people, who James is referring to as useless and senseless, who only believe that faith leads to salvation, are worse than the demons, because the demons at least get this part. They are superficial, they are callous, They are doomed until they have genuine faith and obedience in the one and only loving God. So in verse 20, James continues his diatribe. Let's read that. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Another way to say this is, do you want to be shown? So instead of, but are you willing to recognize? Do you want to be shown, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? So he asks another question here. He's going to ask another question there in verse 21. Again, very similar or very consistent with the styles of writing that we saw back then whenever something like this was written. The senseless thing that James sees here is that this person who has faith in Christ, that we see from chapter 2, verse 1, and monotheism, which we see from chapter 2, just the previous verse 19, cannot reconcile with ignoring poor and needy. You cannot have faith in Christ, be monotheistic in your belief of believing God is one, saying the Shema, and cannot reconcile that with ignoring the poor and the needy. So this is a moral and intellectual diatribe towards his opponent. As we think through this, remember that James thinks that a faith without works is useless. Again, chapter 2, verse 14. Unsaving, again, chapter 2, verse 14. Dead, chapter 2, verse 17. And futile, where we are right now, in this verse right now, chapter 2, verse 20. So this can be paralleled as we look through this with hearing and doing from 1:22. As hearing without doing is useless, so is faith without works. So if you were to go back to chapter 1, verse 22, but prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. So James is coming back and forth in his letter, referencing back to previous parts of his letter to kind of bring the whole story home as he goes through this, like I said, diatribe with these people. So for the most part, he is, you could argue, some would say he is a defender of the faith. You could argue that. He is an apologist, to a point. That could be argued as well. But what we're really seeing that he's a pretty good theologian who is taking apart his opponent's theology. The word usage is useless or non-working. Works that workless as an ineffective or barren in production. So your works, again, it goes back to James isn't defining what works is. It's defined by your obedience to God. It's not defined by humans. So this work that they said they were doing was ineffective or barren. It was useless, worthless. And that is where we're seeing with James as we look at the end of verse 20. Let's have a little bit of a side note here. I'm going to hit briefly related to the Reformation, where it's almost like it's not been taken as seriously since then, related to this nuanced faith of being demonstrated by works, where they say it's almost like since the Reformation there's been more emphasis that this is a sequential relationship, and that is not what James is saying here. Faith and works are together; they're synonymous. It happens at the same time. Synonymous is probably not the best word, but it's a package. It's a single package. It's not like I got two gifts, faith and works. It is I have one, and this is it. It's not a sequential relationship. And sometimes I believe, and I have seen that since that time, it's like, oh, if you have faith, then obviously then you'll have good works. That comes next after faith, and that's not true, nor what James is trying to emphasize here. Like I said, James is trying to emphasize that faith and works are inseparable. He is not distinguishing them as their own. Like I said, it's not a sequential relationship. There's no sequence to any of this. It is coming together. As we look into verse 21, this gets very interesting too and a little muddy. And the reason I say that, probably muddy, is that the right word? It gets a little down in the weeds, maybe a little bit, because we start bringing references into the Patriarch Abraham. So just to read this real quick, another question. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his own son, on the altar? wow, he just threw in a boom. That's a big patriarch reference here that these people need to be able to answer to. We don't get the answer really right off related to this, but you have to think, why would he ask this question? Some would say that James and Paul saw this a little bit differently. They didn't really fully agree regarding this reference to Abraham. So we can go back to Genesis 15. And so Paul uses Genesis 15:6 to say that Abraham was justified prior to being circumcised. James opts for more of a standard Jewish viewpoint that read Abraham's willingness to sacrifice, Genesis 22, as the reason his righteousness was credited to him, forgive this word, but proleptically in Genesis 15:6. So this idea that this happened kind of, it was assigned to him earlier on than when it actually happened. So that is one way to look at it. And so there's those references going back to Genesis 15:6 and to Genesis 22. What does this really say about Paul and James? I would say nothing, really. What it really says is that Jewish scripture reading is full of rich and diverse traditions, and we should embrace those rich and full and diverse traditions because how we're going to translate this. Neither one of them are right or wrong. It's not like, well, I'm going to stand with Paul because of what he says about Genesis 15:6. I'm going to stand with James because of what he says about Genesis 15:6. That's not the point that he is trying to make here. Well, that's not the point that I'm trying to make here. It's more of, you got to take this as something that is living, breathing, and is something that we can translate and continue to translate even in our own time about what exactly it is that James is talking about. Some ideas related to this as this idea of the father Abraham. In other versions, you've probably seen this as an ancestor, like, was not Abraham our ancestor, justified by works? He was the ancestor or the father of the Jews. Thus, he was the father of the Messianic Jews as well. And some people will agree with that, and some people won't. This was typical view up until, so that Abraham was the father of Messianic Jews, up until the point about Justin the martyr. And when that happened, Abraham became a figure of intense separation between Jews and Christians, where Christians had begun to separate themselves from a lot of the Jewish religious ideas and practices, a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament. This idea of supersessionism came in, which is the theological view on the current status of the church in relation to the Jewish people and Judaism, which for the most part believes that the Christian church has succeeded the Israelites as the definitive people of God, or, another way to look at it, that the new covenant has replaced or superseded the Mosaic covenant. Man, the amount of debates you could have about this, right? I mean, there's so much that could be discussed and nitpicked and determined from here. Not for me to decide. I can see it from, I could see that being possible, but I could also see that who the Jewish people still are in the eyes of God as being still part of the original possibilities. From a supersessionist point of view, just by continuing to exist outside the church or the Jewish descent, this contrasts directly with what is referred to as dual covenant theology, which I probably am a little bit more closer to, which holds that the Mosaic covenant remains valid for Jews. Again, it's one of those things that are up for debate. It's well beyond the breadth of this conversation that we're having today, but it is something that we can always think about and just kind of want to ponder. And it goes back to the idea of the Jewish traditions. There's a lot of rich and diverse viewpoints related to religions or the Jewish religion of the past and its present stance. Based on the limited time we have and everything, and then the amount of rabbit holes or rabbit trails we could go down as we try to figure this out, we're going to focus on what James is writing in his context regarding justification and not bring in Paul's definition or his viewpoint. So let's first of all look at righteousness or righteous. So to conform to a standard. So looking back here at Abraham, the ancestor or father, justification or righteousness by works are interchangeable. So to conform to a standard, to be justified or righteous, is the same in this context. Can look at becoming judicially vindicated as having complied with the requirements of the law of God. Judaism's view of righteous, one's behavior in life conforms to the Torah as interpreted by one's authorities. To be righteous in the Messianic community means one life conforms to the Torah as interpreted by Jesus, which seems to be the way to go. At least that's my viewpoint. Righteous in the world of Paul means conform to the standard of God by union with Christ, which you can't disagree with that either. Focus on what James is saying in his letter. Faith and works, again, are inseparable. Like I said, they're not sequential, they're inseparable. We can see justified as the opposite of useless, unsaving, worthless, dead, barren, ineffective. So to be justified is to be saved, to have a useful life, life full of good works, a full life that is life of salvation and saving, a useful life in the presence of God, related to righteousness. We can reference back to the earlier chapter 1, verses 18, which one lives out God's will as taught by Jesus, a saving relationship with God through the new birth. The Jewish tradition saw Abraham as an example of hospitality. Abraham survived a test by remaining faithful to God, and God the provider justified Abraham on the basis of that kind of faithfulness and works. So let's think about that. So justification by works is more works of mercy and works of the law, or task that is a way to interpret the Torah of observance. Let's continue on here. Let's go into verse 22. You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. I'm going to read 23 because it's one sentence. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. So, as we know, this was written before the Reformers, before the time of the Reformation, but it seems that James may have had a sense that this would be an issue in the future. So we should see Abraham's faith here. We cannot simply say that first he had faith and then he had works, and then once he had both, he had what he needed to get salvation. It was a working faith, not a faith plus works, which again, like I said, was an issue kind of post-Reformation, or continues to be to this day. He is possibly using works as a response to how Paul used works when expressing commitment to the Torah. So if you were to go to Galatians 2, 15 through 21, you'd see that sort of reference to that. You have to remember, James and his listeners were still very Jewish, so they understand that the combination of the Father of Israel and the overt confession of monotheism and works of mercy to those in need is what James needs to show his point. The completion or the perfection, so sometimes you may see perfection or fulfilled or completion, all for the most part meaning the same thing here, is based on complete faith that leads to a complete faith. Faith finds its shape when it is working. It's a full realization, the intention of which it is created. So a full realization of who we are in God. James' point here is similar to what we would see in Galatians 5:6. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. As things find their intent and purpose, you have to think about this. The sacrificial system seen its purpose is on the cross. The Torah finds its teaching in that of Jesus. So if you were to turn to Matthew 5:17 through 20. So faith finds its purpose when it becomes active in deeds of mercy. As we continue into verse 23, the faithfulness or faith of Abraham goes beyond a statement of faith in Genesis, what you see from Genesis 15:6. His faith was not complete until the binding up of his son. Could be an argument. This is more than just trust and believing. This is acting on faith. It is the works that James has been referring to. He is living out his faith. Like I said before, Paul looked at Abraham as faith before works, but James looked at Abraham's faith as faith with works. Paul wants to show Abraham was justified prior to circumcision or any acts and works, and James does not believe that Abraham's faith was not perfected until the binding up of his son. At this point, it seems like we've kind of just boiled this down almost to a nice fine glaze of hermeneutics or interpretation of the Jewish world, or what they would see or believe. Like I said, this could be discussed. There's books, there's commentaries, articles written just about this debate related to exactly what they were referring to when they talked about Abraham and what that looked like. In verse 24, you get pretty much a repeat of chapter 20, verse 20. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. To James, a person is justified, which is positive, by works, negative side of it, not by faith alone. Justification is to be declared by God, not by man. Those who are declared justified by God are so by the virtue of their works, the fruit in which they've produced. Abraham has a confessional, kind of creedal and workless faith until he's bound up his son in faith. So it was kind of a workless, like I said before, you can have that, but that's not what James is looking for. He's looking for the full faith. Faith alone is a confession of monotheism, which would have been a big deal for the people during this time. I think it's a big deal for us today because there's so many other religious influences that we can look at. Faith is not perfected or comes to completion unless they are faithful in their faith, and that's not going to happen. I don't know if it's ever completed or ever perfected here on earth, or here in our current status here on earth. It hopefully someday will be. Continuing on, the salvation of faith or saving faith is a trusting faith that flows into deeds of mercy. Non-saving faith has no deeds of mercy. So you have to think about it that way too. What is your motivation? What is it? Why are you having these deeds? What is it? Or why are you performing these deeds? James may distinguish a faith from works, but he leaves no room for a saving faith that does not have works or deeds. Let me just read verses 25 and 26, and we'll wrap this up. In the same way was not Rahab, so he brings Rahab in, which probably was all kinds of fun for the people who are hearing this. The harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. Rahab has, apparently according to James, has an active faith as well, showing that faith and works are going together. Works as in deeds of mercy. Now, those who have really studied Rahab and what happened in that situation and what she did could probably argue the other way around this, saying, well, she was just doing something to save her family. Well, she was obviously familiar with at that point, the God of Israel, and understood that if she didn't do something, that her people would be destroyed or killed. So you could look at that as faith. And it could be the type of faith that Paul is looking at. So she shows mercy to these people. So that could be, so you could argue that. So I mean, there's argument for it, but I could also see some people arguing, well, really, was that the kind of faith that James is referring to? Again, a lot of debate through that. So you could argue that James, even though it'd be weird, not weird, it may be weird to Abraham. It's like, hey, I'm a patriarch, but you're saying that I and Rahab are comparable in our faith? And that's one thing that you'd have to think about as well. Is that what James is saying here? Justified, you can think of it that way. Rahab, to be judged in the right by God, or be made righteous, or to be vindicated before God. To argue that point. James sees Rahab's possibility in her works, how she was merciful to those people. Her treatment of the Israelites in need, she set a standard for the Messianic community to be able to show those who are watching and listening and paying attention in that community, this new church community, about how to live a way of a merciful life. All right, final verse, verse 26 here. There's nothing new in this verse that has not already been said. It's a summary, but that has been very implicit. You can also, it's been implicit and explicit the entire chapter ever since verse 1 of this. We have an analogy here. We see that here that the Spirit gives life and animates the body. Our central theme in this section is that faith and works cannot be separated. They're not sequential. If the faith is saving and works are justifying. We can see faith as confessional and works as behavioral. But a saving faith is one which the confession is manifest in works of mercy towards those in need. So Jesus quotes Isaiah in Matthew 15:8 when he says, "These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." As Matthew 5:16 states, we should instead be, "Let our light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So according to James, either there is a plain faith that does not live out works, this one is dead, or one has a saving kind of faith that lives out in its works. So that's where James is from this. As sin is dead without the law to give it life, so is faith without works. So if you looked at Romans 7:8, you'd get a good example of that. So we have to keep in mind as we wrap up here that the Christian understanding of faith is far more complex than discerning both the difference and relationship of faith and works. It's not complex, but there's multiple levels and layers to what is going on here. There's a lot of takeaways that we can take from what we're seeing here that James is speaking of, and a lot of reflection. I think the biggest part of this is there's a lot of reflection that we can have on our own lives about how we live. What are our works tied to? Are they tied to our own needs? Or are they tied based on our faith and obedience to God? And James ultimately is speaking here that our faith should be, our lives should be based on our faith and our obedience in God. And from there, we get the fruits that come to us or derive through the Holy Spirit, not through our own making. So that's where we'll wrap up today. Next time we'll look at chapter 3 of James and start speaking about the tongue of fire and all the damage the tongue can do. So that's going to be all kinds of fun as we go through that. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day, and hope to see you soon. Thanks.